Adeline Marsh had been kneeling in the mud for 7 minutes before she realized the man she was trying to drag out of the ditch was not breathing. Not in the ordinary way, at least. His chest rose. She had watched it, once, twice. But the intervals between were wrong. Too long. Too deliberate. Like a clock that had learned to tell time but had forgotten why it mattered. She pressed her palm flat against his sternum through the torn wool of his coat and felt beneath it a heartbeat so slow and so measured it might have belonged to something that had simply decided to be patient about dying. "You are making this very difficult," she said to him, though he was unconscious and therefore an ungenerous conversationalist. The road between Keswick Village and the old Dunmore estate was not traveled at this hour. It was 9:30 in the evening. The October fog had come in from the moor like an uninvited guest who intended to stay, and Adeline had only been on it at all because she had missed the last posting cart and refused to spend another night at the Lamb and Anchor with its damp sheets and its landlord, who asked too many questions about a woman traveling alone. She was 31 years old, she carried her own bag, and she had opinions about damp sheets. These were the facts of her life. The man in the ditch was not a fact she had planned for. He was tall. She could see that, even crumpled as he was, one arm thrown over the lip of the drainage channel as if he had tried to catch himself and simply given up. His coat was good quality, or had been once. His boots were extraordinary, actually, which she noted with the particular eye of someone who had spent years cataloging the contents of other people's houses for estate sales. The leather was old in the way that good things were old, worn smooth, not worn out. His face, what she could see of it, was angular and pale, and he had the kind of stillness that made her think, absurdly, of the marble effigies in the nave of St. Cuthbert's. She checked his wrists for a pulse, found it, slow, steady, deeply strange. "Right," she said, because Adeline Vane had been raised by a practical woman and had inherited her mother's conviction that the appropriate response to any crisis was a single firm syllable followed by action. She got her arms under his and pulled. He was heavier than he looked, which was saying something, because he looked like a man who had been carved from something denser than ordinary flesh. She managed to get him to the verge, then to the low stone wall beside it, and then, because the wall was dry and the ground was not, she propped him against it, retrieved the blanket from her traveling bag, and wrapped it around his shoulders with the efficient tenderness of someone who had nursed her mother through 2 winters of bad lungs and knew that warmth, applied quickly, was worth more than sentiment. She noticed his hands then. The cuts on his palms had already stopped bleeding. Not slowed. Stopped. The skin at the edges of each wound was knitting together with a speed she could not explain and therefore chose not to examine. She gave him water from her flask. Some of it went in. Some of it ran down his chin. He did not wake, but some tension in him eased, like a bow being very slightly unstrung. "I am going to leave you here," she told him, "because I have an appointment in the morning and I do not know you, and this is a perfectly adequate wall." She pulled the blanket more firmly around his shoulders. "There, that is the full extent of my charitable obligation." She picked up her bag. She walked 4 steps. She stopped. The fog pressed close and cold, and the road was empty in both directions. And the man against the wall had the kind of face that made her think he had been alone for a very long time. She put her bag down. "This," she said to no one in particular, "is why I never get anywhere on time." She sat beside him against the wall and watched the fog move, and listened to his impossible heartbeat, and waited for morning. He was gone when she woke. Not gone as in walked away, or gone as in she had imagined him. The blanket was folded neatly on the wall beside her, which was a level of courtesy she had not expected from a man who had been unconscious, and there was a single coin placed on top of it, old enough that she did not immediately recognize the monarch's profile. She turned it over in her fingers. It was warm, as if it had been held for a long time. She put it in her pocket and walked to Keswick. The appointment was for a house called Aldenmore. No, she corrected herself, she was not to use that name. It had been sold and renamed. The solicitor's letter had said Carroll Hall now, which was a perfectly serviceable name for a perfectly serviceable house that needed its contents catalogued before the new owner took possession. Adeline was a cataloger by trade and by temperament. She documented things. She gave them names and values and places in the record. It suited her. What did not suit her, over the following 3 days, was the feeling that she was being watched. It was not unpleasant, precisely. It was more like the feeling of standing in a room where someone had recently been reading, a warmth in the air, a sense of recent occupation. She would turn from a shelf of porcelain and find herself looking at a window, expecting someone, and find only the garden. She would wake in the night at Carroll Hall's modest guest room with the certainty that someone had just spoken her name, and lie in the dark, listening to nothing. On the 4th day, the woman came. She arrived at the servants' entrance, which Adeline found interesting, and she was dressed in the kind of respectable black that could mean either mourning or profession. She was perhaps 60, with a face like good old furniture, handsome, purposeful, and not inclined to explain itself. "Miss Vane," she said, not a question. "Yes," said Adeline, who was standing in the kitchen cataloguing copper pots and did not particularly feel like being interrupted. "I am Hester Dray. I serve as housekeeper to a gentleman who has asked me to convey his thanks for your assistance last week." Adeline set down the pot. "The man in the ditch." "The very same." Hester Dray's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of expression. "He also wishes me to inform you that a debt has been incurred." "I gave a stranger a blanket and sat with him in the fog," Adeline said. "That is not a debt. That is basic decency." "In most circumstances, yes." The housekeeper folded her hands. "In this particular circumstance, I am afraid it is rather more complicated." "How complicated?" The woman looked at her with the patience of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had long since stopped being surprised by the range of responses it produced. "My employer will explain. He would very much like to call on you, if you are willing." Adeline thought about the coin in her pocket, still inexplicably warm after 4 days. She thought about the folded blanket. She thought about a heartbeat that had no right to be as slow as it was. "Thursday," she said. "After 4 o'clock. I will be finished with the library by then." Hester Dray nodded once, as if this was exactly what she had expected, and left. He came on Thursday, as promised, at 4 o'clock precisely, which was the first thing he did that she found genuinely impressive. His name, he told her, was Piers Carew. He was, he said, a scholar by inclination and a wanderer by necessity, and he had been on that road because he had been traveling on foot between 2 places and had underestimated the distance, which she found implausible, but did not say so immediately. He was the man from the ditch. This was obvious. What was less obvious was how thoroughly different he seemed in a chair in a lamplit room, not more ordinary, but more present, as if whatever had been dimmed in him that night had been restored. His eyes were the color of old amber, the kind you found in Baltic collections with ancient things suspended inside them. He held his teacup with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned the habit late. "You folded the blanket," she said, because she had been thinking about it. "It seemed the least I could do." A pause. "It was a very good blanket. It was my mother's. She was a practical woman. It showed." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You sat with me all night." "I sat with myself all night," she said. "You happened to be there. I did not want you to roll back into the ditch." Something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "Miss Vane," he said, "I am going to tell you something that is going to sound extraordinary, and I would ask that you hear it in full before you decide whether to throw me out." "I rarely throw people out," she said. "I find it creates more disruption than it resolves. Say what you need to say." He set the cup down. He looked at his hands, the palms that had healed, she noticed, without a single scar. "I am not entirely what I appear. I am There is a word for it, though I have always found it a somewhat dramatic word. I am what older traditions call a blood sworn, a vampire in the parlance of this century, though I find that word even more dramatic and considerably less accurate. Adeline looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at his hands. Then she looked at his face. "How old?" she said. He considered. 412 years approximately. I lose track of decades occasionally. They tend to blur. "And the debt," she said, "the one your housekeeper mentioned. When one of my kind is brought back from the edge, not of death precisely, but of the state that corresponds to it, by the deliberate and sustained care of a human, a binding occurs. It is not chosen. It is not metaphorical." He met her eyes steadily. "It is a very old law, older than I am, and it means that you and I are now connected in a way that carries obligations on both sides. I owe you my continued existence, and in the accounting of my kind, that is not a small thing." "I see," said Adeline. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not intend it. I did not know you were there until you had already—" "Mr. Carew," she said, and her voice was quite level, but there was something in it that made him stop. "Let me be certain I understand you. You are telling me that because I sat with an unconscious stranger in the fog and gave him water from my flask, I am now bound to him by an ancient supernatural obligation that I had no knowledge of and did not consent to, and that this cannot be easily undone?" "Yes," he said, "that is, in essence, correct." "That," said Adeline, "is the most outrageous thing anyone has ever said to me, and I was once told by a baronet that I had catalogued his grandfather's escritoire incorrectly, which at the time I considered the pinnacle of unreasonable statements." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, looking at the garden, where the last of the autumn roses were going brown at the edges. "I did not agree to this." "No," he said quietly. "You did not. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Not because I wanted anything from you. Not because I wanted to be bound to anyone." She turned around. Her voice was still level, but the levelness was doing a great deal of work. "I have spent 31 years arranging my life so that I am not beholden to anyone, and no one is beholden to me. I am very good at it. I have a system." "I know," he said, "and I am genuinely sorry. If I could undo it, I would." "Can you?" A silence that told her the answer before he spoke it. "I don't know. I have been trying to find out." She looked at him. This man who had been alive for 4 centuries and still managed to look faintly embarrassed, which she found, despite everything, somewhat disarming. "You had better keep looking," she said. "And in the meantime, you had better sit down and tell me everything, because I refuse to be bound to a situation I don't understand." He told her. It took 2 hours, 3 pots of tea, and one moment where she had to ask him to stop and give her a few minutes to simply stare at the ceiling, which she did, and then she said, "Continue," and he did. He told her about the binding, called a vow of return in the older language, the one that had named it before anyone thought to write it down, and how it worked and what it meant for both of them. He told her that she would begin to sense him at distances, that she might have already. She thought of the feeling of being watched, of waking with her name in the air, and that he would be able to find her regardless of where she went, not as a threat, but as a consequence, like a compass finding north. He told her that others of his kind would know. That was the part she found most troubling. "Others," she said. "How many others?" "There are perhaps a dozen in England," he said. "They will feel the binding. It is perceptible to those who know what to look for, like a new chord in a piece of music they know very well." "And will they care?" He looked at his hands again. "Some of them will." She absorbed this. "You should have told me immediately." "I was trying to find a way to break it first," he said, "so that I could tell you it was already resolved. I thought that would be kinder." "It would have been less kind," she said. "It would have been managing me." She looked at him squarely. Do not manage me, Mr. Carew. I am not a difficult situation to be handled. I am a person. Something in his face shifted, not the amber eyes, those stayed steady, but something around them, some long-held tension. Yes, he said. You are. I apologize. She had not expected the apology to be that simple or that genuine, and it unsettled her more than the argument would have. The trouble came, as Piers had predicted it would, within the fortnight. His name was Rowan Galt, and he arrived at Carrow Hall on a Tuesday afternoon with a calling card and a smile that had been assembled very carefully from components that did not quite belong together. He was perhaps 35 in appearance. Adeline had learned, since her conversation with Piers, to note that appearance was a different thing from age, and he was dressed with the kind of precision that suggested he had opinions about precision. He said he was an associate of Mr. Carew's, which was a word, Adeline noted, that he had chosen instead of friend. I understand, he said, sitting in the chair across from her in the drawing-room, that you have become rather entangled with an old acquaintance of mine. I have had a conversation with Mr. Carew, Adeline said. Whether that constitutes entanglement depends on one's definitions. Galt smiled. The smile was the most carefully assembled part of him. The vow of return is not a conversation, Miss Vane. It is a chain, and chains, in my experience, are only interesting insofar as they tell you what someone values enough to be chained to. He tilted his head. Piers values very little. He has made rather a project of it over the centuries, which makes you quite remarkable. I am not remarkable, she said. I am a cataloguer. I sat in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps. He looked around the room with the proprietary air of someone assessing what belonged to him. I have a proposal. The binding can be transferred, not broken, but redirected, to a different blood sworn. If you were to agree, you would be free of Piers entirely, and your new obligation would be to someone who could offer you rather more than a wandering scholar with no house and no title and no particular prospects. Adeline looked at him for a long moment. You want me to trade one binding I did not choose for another binding I did not choose, except this time it would be to you. This time it would be to someone with resources, with influence, with the ability to make your life considerably more comfortable. My life is already comfortable, she said. I have a system. Miss Vane. No, she said, cleanly, without decoration. I am not a debt to be purchased, Mr. Galt. I am not an asset to be transferred. And if you attempt to pursue this through any means other than conversation, I will be writing a very detailed letter to every solicitor, magistrate, and ecclesiastical authority in this county describing your activities, your nature, and your whereabouts. And I will be doing it from a location you will not be able to find, because I am very good at disappearing into the administrative machinery of the English countryside when I need to. She had not entirely planned the speech, but she found, once it was out, that she meant every word of it. Galt looked at her. His smile did not disappear. It simply became a different kind of smile, the kind that acknowledged a point had been scored without conceding the game. Piers chose well, he said, even if he did not choose intentionally. He stood. I will not press the matter today, but the offer stands, and Miss Vane, the vow of return does not simply bind you to him, it makes you visible to all of us. You should consider whether you want that visibility without protection. He left. Adeline sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, and then she went to find Piers. She found him at the edge of the estate's kitchen garden, which he had apparently been walking through because he had known she would want him, and had come as close as he could without being summoned. This was the compass-finding north aspect of the binding, and she was still deciding how she felt about it. Rowan Galt, she said. His expression told her he had been expecting this. What did he say? She told him. All of it. She watched his face while she talked, the way it went very still, then very controlled, in the manner of someone who had learned over centuries that the first response to anger was rarely the wisest one. He cannot transfer the binding without your consent, Piers said, when she had finished. He knows that. What he is doing is making you afraid enough to give it. I told him no. I know. He stopped. I felt it. The moment you refused him. It was like the binding registered it. You were very certain. I am generally certain when I mean no, she said. What I am less certain about is what happens next. Because he said the offer stands. And he said I was visible. And I would like to know what that means in practical terms. It means, Piers said, that other bloodsworn will know the vow of return has been activated. Some will be curious, some will be indifferent. Galt. He looked away toward the moor. Galt collects. He always has. Not objects, obligations. People who owe him things. The binding makes you look like an acquisition he has not yet made. Then we need to find a way to break it, she said, or make it legible enough that he cannot use it as leverage. I have been looking, he said. There is a record, a very old one, held at a priory in the north, that describes the original terms of the vow. If there is a method of dissolution, it would be there. Then we should go. He looked at her. It is a 3-day journey. I am aware of how distance works, she said. I travel for a living. Can you arrange a conveyance, or shall I? There was a pause, and then he said, I have a horse. I will hire a carriage, she said. Your horse can follow along and feel useful. It was the first time she had seen him actually smile. Not the direction of one, not the possibility of one, but the real thing, sudden and a little startled, as if it had caught him off guard. It changed his face considerably. She looked away before she could think too carefully about that. They went north. The Priory of St. Anselm's sat in a valley that the Moor had been attempting to reclaim for several centuries, and the librarian, Brother Aldous, who was 70 years old and had the focused energy of a man who had found his purpose and intended to pursue it until the universe itself gave up, received them with the wariness of someone who had seen unusual requests before and had developed a filing system for them. The vow of return, he said, looking at Piers over the rims of his spectacles. You are the second person this decade to ask about it. Who was the first? Piers said. A man named Galt, said Brother Aldous, and then he looked at Adeline. I did not like him. Your instincts are sound, she said. The record was a manuscript, 300 years old, written in a mixture of Latin and something older that Piers translated with the ease of someone who had been alive when it was current usage. Adeline sat beside him at the reading table with a notebook and wrote down what he said, because she was a cataloger and she did not trust important information to memory alone. The manuscript described the vow in terms she was beginning to understand. A binding of life debt, ancient and automatic, triggered by sustained and selfless care. It described its obligations. It described its duration. And then, in a passage so small it was almost a footnote, it described its resolution. The vow of return, Piers read, his voice very quiet, may be dissolved only when the debt it describes has been repaid in kind, that is, when the bound human offers a reciprocal act of preservation, freely given and freely received, and when the blood sworn releases the claim upon the life given, surrendering the advantage of the binding without replacement. He stopped. Adeline looked at what she had written. Repaid in kind, she said. What does that mean exactly? What constitutes preservation for someone who is already 400 years old? He was quiet for a moment. The manuscript is describing mortality, he said. It is describing the choice to become mortal, to release the binding, to truly dissolve it. The blood sworn must surrender the immortality that the vow protects. It is not a legal dissolution. It is a physical one. He looked at the page. The binding ends when I am no longer what I am. Adeline looked at him. He was looking at the manuscript with an expression she could not quite name, not grief, not relief, something more complicated than either. That is what Galt was looking for, she said slowly. When he came here, he wanted to know if there was a method of dissolution. He was not looking to break the binding. He was looking to find out whether you could be made mortal. Yes, Piers said, and now he knows. They were 3 hours from the Priory on the road south when the carriage stopped. It stopped because there was another carriage across the road, and a man standing beside it, and the man was Rowan Galt, and he had two others with him, older by the feel of them, the particular stillness that Adeline had learned to recognize in the 3 weeks since all of this had begun. She had catalogued many things. She had begun to catalogue this. Galt opened the door of their carriage himself. He looked at Piers, and then at Adeline, and his smile was the kind that had given up pretending to be pleasant. "I know what the manuscript says," he said. "I have known for 8 years. What I did not know was whether Piers would ever find it, or whether, if he did, he would care enough about someone to consider acting on it." He looked at Adeline. "You are more dangerous than you look, Miss Vane." "People often say that," she said, "and I always find it more informative about them than about me." "I want the binding," Galt said. "Not transferred. I know you will not consent to that. I want it as leverage. Piers will come with me, willingly, and spend the next 50 years doing what I require of him, or I will make your life, your very ordinary, unprotected, human life, considerably more difficult than it needs to be. I have resources. I have patience. I have been alive long enough to understand that the most effective pressure is the kind that is applied slowly." He said it pleasantly, which was the most unpleasant part. Adeline sat very still. She could feel Piers beside her, not physically, but in the way the binding worked, the compass and north sensation, and what she felt from him was a kind of braced resignation, the posture of a man who had decided to absorb something so that someone else did not have to. She was not going to allow that. "Mr. Galt," she said, "you have just described a plan that relies entirely on the assumption that I will be frightened into compliance, and that Mr. Carew will sacrifice himself to protect me from your interference." She opened her notebook, the one she had been writing in at the Priory, and held it up. "I have spent the last 3 hours writing a very complete account of everything I know about you. Your name, your nature, your activities, your visit to St. Anselm's Priory 8 years ago, which Brother Aldous will confirm. Your visit to Carrow Hall, which the housekeeper there will confirm. Your presence on this road today, which the driver of this carriage will confirm." She looked at him. "I am a cataloguer. I document things, and I have sent a copy of this document, by post, to a solicitor in London, with instructions that it be delivered to the appropriate authorities should I fail to send a specific letter of confirmation within the week." This was not entirely true. She had sent the letter, but she had sent it this morning from the Priory, before they had encountered Galt, and she had sent it to her friend Dorothea Baines in London with instructions to hold it, because she had been thinking about contingencies. The part about the specific confirmation letter was an improvisation, but it was a good one, and she delivered it without inflection. Galt looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He was calculating. "You are bluffing," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "Are you certain enough to test it?" A silence that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and then longer. "Piers," Galt said, not taking his eyes from Adeline, "you have managed to entangle yourself with the most inconvenient woman in England." "I am aware," Piers said. There was something in his voice that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one. Galt stepped back from the carriage door. "This is not finished," he said. "Actually," Adeline said, "I think you will find that it is. Because if you persist, the document goes to the authorities, and you become a person of public record, which I understand is deeply inconvenient for someone who relies on not being noticed. And if you attempt to pressure Mr. Carew through me again, I will send a second document to every blood sworn in England, describing exactly what you did today, and how it ended, which I suspect will be even more inconvenient." She closed the notebook. "I have a system, Mr. Galt. It runs on documentation. You do not want to be in my files." He left. The two with him left. The road cleared. The carriage did not move for a moment, because the driver needed a moment, and Adeline thought that was entirely reasonable. Then Piers said, "The letter." "Sent this morning," she said. "I did not invent the letter. I invented the confirmation clause." "You catalogued him," he said, "before he was even a threat." "I catalogued the possibility of him," she said. "I noticed you were worried when you told me others would know about the binding. I made a note. I took a precaution." She looked out the window at the moor, where the light was going gold and thin. "That is what I do. I notice things, and I write them down, and I make them legible." "You saved us," he said, simply, without decoration. "We saved us," she said. "You translated the manuscript. I handled Galt. It was a cooperative effort." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The manuscript." "Yes," she said. "What it describes, the dissolution. It is not a requirement. The binding does not require it. It is simply a choice," she said. "I know." "I have been alive for 400 years," he said, "and I have not found a great deal worth choosing mortality for." She did not say anything. The carriage moved south, and the moor rolled past, and the light continued to thin. "I would like," he said very carefully, "to know what you think about whether it is worth it." She turned to look at him. His amber eyes were steady and waiting, and he had the look of someone who had asked a question they were genuinely uncertain of the answer to, which she suspected was a rare experience for a man who had had 4 centuries to form opinions. "I think," she said, "that I cannot answer that question for you. It would be wrong for me to answer it. You are asking me to tell you whether your life is worth trading, and I am not in a position to know that." She paused. "What I can tell you is that I have spent 31 years arranging my life so that I do not need anyone, and I have been very successful at it, and I am sitting in a carriage in the north of England, having just committed document fraud on behalf of a 400-year-old vampire, and I find that I am not sorry." He looked at her. "That is not an answer." "No," she said. "It is a different kind of answer, the kind that tells you which direction to think in." They arrived back at Carrow Hall on the evening of the 3rd day, and Adeline resumed her cataloguing, and Piers stayed in the village at the Lamb and Anchor. She noted, with private amusement, that he also had opinions about damp sheets, expressed with the weary authority of someone who had slept in worse things across 4 centuries. And they met each afternoon to talk, which was what they called it, though what they were doing was also something else, something that did not yet have a name between them. He told her about the years, not all of them. 400 years was more than an afternoon's conversation, but pieces, the decades that had blurred, the things he had watched change, the things that had not changed, which surprised him more. He had been a physician's assistant in the 15th century, before he had known what he was, and the habit of observation had stayed with him. He noticed things in the way she noticed things, though he had had considerably longer to practice. She told him about the cataloguing, about her mother, who had been a practical woman with impractical dreams, and who had taught Adeline to write everything down because memory was unreliable and paper was honest. About the estate sales, and the strange intimacy of going through other people's things. The way you could read a whole life in the objects someone had chosen to keep. About the coin he had left on the blanket, which she still carried, which she had identified eventually as Venetian, from the 16th century. "You kept it," he said. "It is old and interesting," she said. "I keep old and interesting things. It is professional." "Of course," he said, in the tone of someone who was not going to argue the point. On the 9th day after their return, she came to find him in the morning rather than the afternoon, which was unusual enough that he was already standing when she arrived, reading her approach in the compass. Sensation before she knocked. "I have been thinking," she said, when he opened the door, "about the dissolution." He stepped back to let her in. The room was small and full of books. He had apparently made arrangements with the Lamb and Anchor's proprietor to use the back parlor and had filled it with the kind of scholarly disorder that suggested he had been thinking too. "So have I," he said.